Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is the podcast where we share insights from experts on how you can actually grow your strength training studio business. This is episode 321, and today's topic is how to make better decisions in your business and life. And this is part 7 of my series with Dave Smith, PhD. Dave is a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology, who also has a deep fascination and much wisdom in decision-making processes, which is what we are focused on today. Welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Great to be here, Lawrence.
Great to have you. Thanks again for doing this. Really appreciate your time and very grateful for all the time you've contributed over this series so far. And so, where we wanted to kick off this one with was regarding algorithms. So using algorithms to automate decision-making as much as possible. This really turns me on, this subject, because I'm a bit of a nerd for stuff like this. So I'm excited to get into this one with you.
Fantastic. That's great. And it's funny, you use the word nerd, and it's quite interesting because when you ask most people what they think an algorithm is, they'll tell you that it's something like some kind of fancy computer program or a complex equation. And most people who aren't into those kind of things are quite scared of them. They find them quite scary and quite off-putting, and they think they're for people doing a PhD in physics or some kind of computer nerd who sits in a basement all day writing code. But actually, algorithms, the meaning of the word algorithm is a lot broader and a lot simpler than that. It's simply a set of rules designed to solve a problem. So, of course, computer code and, of course, a lot of equations. Well, an equation is essentially an algorithm, but there are many other things that are algorithms as well that I think the general public won't think of in that way. And these can be really your best friend in decision making and can help you, as you said in the intro, automate your decision making as much as possible. And in a recent interview, Danny Kahneman, who's one of the, as you know, I've talked about quite a bit on the podcast, when he was asked for his, to distill some of his wisdom from more than half a century of research on decision making, he said, well, the most important thing is to automate your decision making as much as possible.
Wow, that's so profound.
Yeah, absolutely, really profound. And but as we'll see, it's advice that some people are really loath to take. I must acknowledge as well, I'm indebted to a fund manager, Ben Whitmore of Jupiter Asset Management, and I should say other fund managers are available, of course, who gave a presentation on this a couple of years ago, and a friend of mine passed it on to me. It was recorded, and that got me really thinking about how I could apply some of these ideas to my own work in a sports context. Ben was talking about the use of algorithms in behavioral finance, of course. However, there was so much, it was so rich in terms of the ideas, and I just thought, wow, I could really make more use of algorithmic kind of thinking and processes in my work with clients. And it was one of the things, along with some other techniques that I've learned over the years from the like of Danny Kahneman and Michael Mauboussin, that really turbocharged for me my effectiveness as a consultant, as well as really turbocharging my own decision-making skills in my own life. So that's I think it's always good to acknowledge when you get these kind of influences. So I think the first thing then is trying to understand what an algorithm is. So something as simple as a recipe, if you're trying to, cook some dinner, or a recipe for a cocktail, for example, would be an algorithm. So if you want to make an espresso martini, you might have a list of ingredients, say, golden castor sugar, some vodka, some freshly brewed espresso, some coffee liqueur, maybe some coffee beans to garnish it. And it'll tell you exactly what to do with each of these ingredients, how much to put in. Now, the key thing here is that if you don't stick to the algorithm, for example, if you say, well, actually, you know what, I don't have an espresso machine, so I'm just going to use some of this instant coffee I got here, a jar from the supermarket that cost me 40 cents or something, and you bung that in, it probably won't work. It probably won't taste as nice. So the key principle here is that following the algorithm is absolutely crucial. So Ben Whitmore gave a great example in his talk. He talked about the dreaded IKEA algorithm, when you have flat pack furniture and you get it home and there's this massive list of instructions on there and you think, oh my goodness. And what do? You start trying to fit it together yourself without following the algorithm, and that way it lies disaster. It'll never end up looking like it's meant to, or functioning like it's meant to.
Or you take one step further and you realize you can't even follow the instructions properly, so you do what I do and you just phone someone who's far more competent at building stuff.
Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that I would end up doing. Either that, or I get so annoyed at the thing I kind of smash it with a hammer and it goes I buy one instead that's fully formed. But the point is that good algorithms don't have to be complex. The best ones are actually very, very simple. And the best kind of algorithms that we can often use to help us in business take the form of a simple checklist. And there are many examples of this. And I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Checklist Manifesto.
Yeah, great. Well, I think it could be reduced to a blog post, but the idea in the book is priceless.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really, there's some great ideas in there. And I'd recommend anyone that hasn't read it, who's interested in this stuff, I think it's really, really interesting. So there's some classic algorithms that are all very simple that have had a huge impact on decision making in different areas. So a classic example would be the APGAR score, which was developed in the 1950s by Dr. Virginia Apgar, which is basically trying to reduce infant mortality by looking for simple things that midwives can measure within the first minute of a baby being born. So it's really simple. And the idea itself was literally conceived by Dr. Apgar over the breakfast table. There were just things that had been knocking around in her head that were important. And she thought, well, if I could put these in the form of a simple checklist for midwives, that would be really, really helpful. And what you've got to do when the baby pops out, you've got to mark each of these things out of 10, and any that have a score of less than 6, you observe and you remeasure. So you measure the baby's heart rate, their breathing, their reflexes, their muscle tone, and their skin coloration. Okay? And if you're having trouble with any of those, you know that that's a big warning sign and you need to take further action. Now, according to a review in The Lancet a few years ago, this has saved many thousands of lives, and it's so effective that it's still in use today in its original form. So, it's a great example of a very simple checklist that we can use. Another example was Professor Orley Ashenfelter's wine growing algorithm. I don't know if you've come across that one. Well, I don't know if you're a bit of a wine buff, but Professor Ashenfelter was, and he was really frustrated because he kept getting really bad recommendations for wine. People would say, try this wine, it's amazing, and he'd try it and he didn't like it. So he wanted to predict which Bordeaux wines would be good, okay? And, this is good partly because if you're drinking the wine, it's going to taste nicer. And also good wines can be worth a lot of money. Okay. So he came up with this algorithm where basically you measured the average rainfall during winter in the year the wine was produced, the average temperature, and the average sunshine during the growing season. And all you have to do is to combine those three things into a single measure. Very simple to do. And what he found was that produced a correlation of 0.9 with the price of the wine 5 to 10 years down the line. And a correlation of 0.9 is very, very high. So essentially, a simple algorithm is much better at predicting the quality of wine than all the experts who, give opinion about whether it's been likely to be a good or a bad year. But the funny thing is, people are so hostile about algorithms, and his is a great example. Why the wine growers in Bordeaux went absolutely nuts about this. They got really angry and they wrote letters to the newspapers, and they said, what you're trying to do is it's like trying to judge the quality of a movie without actually seeing the movie, And Ashenfelter's retort was simply, but it works.
Yeah,
and it absolutely did. And the other one, the one that always makes me chuckle, is the so-called marriage algorithm that the late Dr. Robin Dawes came up with, and he was decision-making researcher who basically wanted to try to demonstrate that more complicated formulas are less helpful, and the simpler the better. So he came up with a number of ways in which you could try to predict somebody's marital stability, okay? And it all kinds of complicated things you could throw in the algorithm, and it didn't seem to predict how long people's marriages would last very well. But the thing that predicted best longevity of marriage was actually very, very simple. It was the frequency of something I don't want to explicitly talk about in a child-friendly podcast, minus the frequency of quarrels. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you for your own calculation on this, Lawrence, but I can say you want to have a positive number coming out, okay? And the more positive the number, the better. And that has an amazingly strong predictive ability in terms of marriage longevity. So algorithms consistently beat human judgment in unpredictable situations. And everybody listening to this podcast who's in the personal training or fitness or gym business in one way or another, you're all in a very unpredictable world, the world of business. And therefore, algorithms could potentially be useful to you. There are hundreds of studies that show this, literally. I mean, if we could literally do a whole series of podcasts just dissecting all the studies that have looked at this, because there's so many of them. We'd be doing it for years. Studies on cancer survival rates, on grades achieved at school, and the real on successful surgery, on aviation safety. I always think aviation safety is the classic example, because the aviation people were so taken by the results of the research on this that, as you probably know, they use checklists, and they're absolutely an essential part of, for example, aircraft taking off and landing. And in fact, if you ever seen the TV show, I think it's on National Geographic, Air Crash Investigation.
No, I haven't seen. Rings a bell, but I don't think I've seen it.
Yeah, basically what they do is they look at air crashes and they look at the investigation that happened afterwards and the causes of the crash. Now, it's amazing how often the cause of the air crash is simply people either skipping a key part of a checklist or not performing it in the correct way. So checklists are really crucial in aviation, and the number one thing that you've got to do to minimize the likelihood of things going wrong is to always be, always use the checklist fully and in the way to which it's intended. It's just extraordinary how often these fatal mistakes occur from missing something out. And what tends to happen in situations like this is it's a bit like the wine growers. Some pilots might get a little arrogant and they think, I don't always need the checklist. I've done this approach thousands of times. I don't, so, and they skip over it for a minute, and that kind of invites disaster. So it's crucial to apply the checklist consistency, but often being human, we don't. I'll tell you a great example, and it's one that I've used, and I think it's an area where anyone listening here who's, for example, recruiting people to work in your gym or in your personal training business will maybe know this, and it's something that might help to take on board, is job interviews. Because normally for a job interview, we might have, for example, essential criteria for the job, and we have desirable criteria, and they are effectively algorithms. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what tends to happen is when you get together in an interview panel and you're interviewing for a job, so often the checklist goes out the window, and instead you start focusing on subjective things about the candidate that you like or you don't like. Mm-hmm. And that is usually inviting disaster. I can tell you, because I've been involved in a lot of interviews in my job. I do a lot of interviewing. And the single biggest mistake you can make in interviewing is going off those criteria, because it usually ends up in disaster. It's very, very subjective, and it doesn't end well. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was on a panel where we were trying to recruit a PhD student. It was a kind of funded position. And so we had our essential criteria. We shortlisted, we sat there and listened to the students presenting, and we talked to them. Okay. And in the end, we got what turned out to be quite a bad outcome. And the reason was that we placed far too much weight on subjective factors, and we basically didn't pay enough attention to the criteria, our algorithm. Yeah. Because what happened in the next few years, often because of the problems we had with the person who got the job, we said, why didn't we pick this other guy? He was perfect. He ticked all the criteria. Well, the reason for that, and the reason the successful candidate got the position, was that they were coached by somebody who knew the panel, including myself, very well, and they were coached to hit the right buttons when they were asked questions and say certain things that they knew we would like. Okay. Right. So even though there was somebody else on the shortlist who actually met the desirable criteria better, we went for the other person. And it, and it was a real struggle, because it turned out they weren't really suited to the role. And so often in the next few years, hindsight, of course, Mr. Hindsight, he always knows best, doesn't he? And we are thinking, why didn't we pick the other guy? But this was a case where you didn't have to have hindsight to see that, because later on, going through the criteria, it was obvious who we should have picked. But we chucked the criteria away, effectively. I mean, they both met the essential ones, but if we had honestly just gone on the desirable criteria, another person would have got the role.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The key takeaway from this, I was going to say, just that we shouldn't ignore the algorithm when we don't like the result it spits out. And that's a disaster when we do that.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I appreciate all the examples. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then I actually want to ask you some questions about that. And this is just to add a little bit more color and put it into a Strength Studio context. So another way of talking about what we're talking about here is systems, right? Or checklists or algorithms, SOPs, standard operating procedures. It's all kind of the same thing or very similar.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely critical obviously to have these in all businesses, but to have it in a strength studio business, so that you can ensure that operations in your business are carried out as they should be, consistently every single time, so they deliver on the results and objectives that you want. Otherwise, there's inconsistency, and you're much less likely to achieve the intended result. An example of this might be, and obviously you should have systems and processes for everything you do in your business more than once. And a good example of that might be an intro workout, which is going to be the sales process for a lot of our colleagues, right? So obviously someone comes in for a free workout. There should literally be a checklist in terms of how that free workout is carried out step by step. What does the initial consultation look like? What does that free workout look like? What's the conversation after the free workout? And I actually did a podcast recently. I think it's within the last 5 or 10 podcasts, called the ultimate hit sales process or something like that. And in there, I actually provided a PDF or an what do I call it? Like a online e-document, whatever you want to call it, of our checklist, which is really been heavily inspired by organizations like Discover Strength, but also a lot of the guests have had on the podcast, and then we've kind of made it our own. And it's a process that I believe we've optimized for conversions, right? So that we convert as many free workouts as possible, which is the whole objective. And obviously the same goes for the workouts. Every time someone comes in for a workout in your business, you should be following a set of rules for that workout, so that workout experience is consistent every time they come in, regardless of who they work with, whatever trainer they go with. That way you're ensuring a very high level customer experience and customer service, and you're also optimizing the outcome that you're gonna generate as many referrals as possible as well, and retain that client. And that's the whole objective, right? So let me just elaborate a little bit more. So for example, because I know that people listen to this, and I know there's so many people in the industry who struggle to create systems, and part of it is probably, 99% of the time, Dave, it's probably down to the fact they can't be bothered. They're like, I'll do that one day, but today I'm just going to do the task, whatever the task I'm going to do, rather than say I'm going to spend a little bit more time today doing the task, but actually writing down the checklist of how I do the task so others can do it. And I'm actually working with someone very close at the moment, and I love it because he understands, he just gets it, and he's so passionate about building the systems because he wants to be able to grow his business and step away from his business. And you can't really do that until you have everything systematized. And so to elaborate on the workout, here's a rule, example of a rule in a workout. So for example, again, I'm not telling people how to train clients here. It's just one idea. But let's say, for instance, that in a workout protocol, you follow, let's say, a 2-4 cadence for 2 seconds positive, 4 second negative, and 8 to 12 repetitions is kind of your target rep range of clients. So you're looking at, that's kind of the time under load you're aiming for of a client. You want them to reach momentary muscular failure in 8 to 12 repetitions. One rule in that algorithm might be, if they hit 7 reps, you reduce the load by 1 increment, so they can get into the 8 to 12 rep range. So you reduce it by 1 increment in their next workout. So that might be a rule that you have to ensure that you get clients in that right rep range, and that's something that, if you've got that in a checklist, then that happens consistently across workouts, across trainers, right? So there's one example. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I thought was really relevant to what you just said about hiring, is you're absolutely right. You should have a really strict hiring process of criteria. And Luke over at Discover Strength has been so generous with sharing the hiring process that DS used. Now, I don't think he shared it in much depth on the podcast, but in Hit Business Membership, which I've mentioned before, he provided the entire process for hiring candidates at Discover Strength. And it's a very long process, like 3 or 4 interviews. And there are, very strict criteria and questions that they always ask in every interview. And obviously I should also say, all of these systems are working documents. They're evolving all the time as you improve them, which is important to say. And because they do it like this, they follow the maxim: hire slow, fire fast. You hire slow because if you take your time, you're going to find the right candidate who's got the right core values and the right fit for your business, who's far more likely to be successful, which is going to be a win-win, versus, having someone in the business who is toxic or a really bad cultural fit and just going to just really damage the culture and cause a lot of pain for everyone, right? Everyone involved. And so, yeah, you want to take your time and follow a process. Now, Dave, with all that said, here's my question. I'm just wondering, you talked about some pretty mathematical algorithms, which, sound like they have a very high probability. Well, they're testable, right? You can actually see that they are effective. How do we make sure that our checklists are productive? Because you can certainly look at my checklist for intro workouts and point out flaws and say, oh, you should do it this way, right? So there's obviously it's not going to be perfect necessarily. So I'm just curious how you think about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In an environment like exercise, there's always going to be room for, and one thing we should always be open to is adjusting those algorithms when new evidence or new information from what we're doing comes to light. But that said, there can still be certain things that you're confident enough that you could put into your checklist. For example, you could have a checklist. Funnily enough, the thing about rep range, I think you're reaching through the internet and reading my notes. That's one of the examples I had.
I definitely saw that from you, probably. But, yeah,
no, I'm sure you didn't. But no. You could also, for example, use a checklist when you're choosing exercise equipment. So that might be a simple one, that there's certain things that certain characteristics that any machines that you buy for your gym, for example, have got to meet, for instance. There might be a checklist when you're doing, something on a kind of broader level as well. When you're choosing a location for your business, where do you set it up? Maybe you can have a checklist of things that you need to think about for the location of the business. You might have a checklist when assessing a client's diet if you do that. Yeah, you might have criteria for judging the success of the client's program as well. How are you going to measure how well it's working? So that there might be, and probably with those things, there's going to be multiple things that need to kind of be factored in. So I think you've always got to maintain a bit of flexibility in the system, though, that when you learn new stuff, you change it. I mean, just before we came on air, we were having a discussion, for example, around training programs and what's likely to be optimal given the recent scientific research. Well, it's not set in stone. We know things about responses to resistance training we didn't know a decade ago. So if you use the same old algorithm, it's probably going to be it might be okay, but it's going to be suboptimal. It's not going to be the very best it can be.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I guess, I know I talked about consistency being part of it. But I'm just wanted to get into the why. I'll just reiterate the why behind why you think this is important. I guess, looking at an extreme case like in aviation and medicine and surgery, it's critical for safety, right? And then one of the other benefits would be decision fatigue, right? Having to always remember how you do something. There's a really famous quote, isn't there? That something I can't remember. Oh man, it's going to really annoy me. I wish I had it to hand. It's something like talking about how civilization advances because we continue to automate things so that humans don't have to do them. But it's way more articulate than that. Mm-hmm. I read this yesterday, but anyway, I was just thinking, a big part of this is reducing decision fatigue. So I don't know if there's any other big upsides that come to mind for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Decision fatigue is a problem, but it's also just more broadly that if we're left to our own devices, our emotions are particularly, our system one tends to get in the way, whereas a more deliberative decision-making process that requires that system two kind of deliberate, rational approach, isn't something that humans will automatically do. We tend to default all the time back to system one. So what a really good checklist can do is focuses on the key things and help therefore keep us on a kind of system two thinking process, rather than thinking that our intuition or our emotions are gonna serve us better. So for example, again, if we have an algorithm that's very much based on the scientific literature on resistance training, for instance, maybe that will stop us getting too emotionally involved in our exercise prescriptions, where we follow, say, a particular writer or a particular bodybuilder or whoever, somebody who advocates a particular approach. If we have it written into our algorithm that we have to follow the data, then we're less likely to fall into that emotional trap of thinking of feeling, oh no, I'm going to follow that particular program because I really like it and it worked for so and so who's, say, a bodybuilder or a personal trainer that we admire. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. Dave, I'm just we're at time, and I think I wouldn't want to rush number 2. I'd rather we left that for the next podcast. And I know that we had to cut today's podcast a little bit short. One of the things I just wanted to say is I want to just encourage those listening who I know need to get systems implemented in their business to just, you'd be amazed if you did one system per week. You have 52 systems in a year. That's a business right there. That's your whole business systematized. And so just start with one system and you'll see the benefits of doing it once, and then it will just create momentum. And I would just start off with looking at your workout and saying, how do we create a checklist for our workout so that all our trainers can deliver amazing workouts? Because that's ultimately the core of your business. So that would be my advice. Any parting thoughts, Dave, before we just grab your details and wrap up?
Sure. A couple of things. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a hugely powerful thing to be able to have an effective checklist for to produce effective workouts. If you look, for example, at the advice that the trainers give out when people join Keyser Training, which is summarized in Werner Keyser's book, it's maybe a dozen or so bullet points, very simple bullet points that effectively are an algorithm on effective training. So something like that can be really, really helpful for clients, and they can take that away and use it to produce decent workouts. And of course, as you know, in that environment, when people deviate from the algorithm there, the trainers are onto it pretty quickly.
And is that in the book Full Strength?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, he's got a.
I have to get to that.
Yeah, I love that book. Do you know? I mean, it's so simple. A lot of the book is given over to very precise descriptions of the different exercises you can do and the different machines that are in Keyser's gym, the Delphex machines. But the actual part of the book that deals with training advice is relatively short, and there's like this summary, which, as I say, is just like a dozen bullet points, which frankly, if anybody follows who's interested in evidence-based resistance training, following those 12 bullet points will get you pretty much or very near to as far as you can go.
I'm going to be picking that up immediately after this and reading that part.
Yeah, have a look and let me know what you think. But I love that book because its simplicity is quite deceptive. But I couldn't go as well without telling the story. You may have heard this one. You probably will have if you've read Gawande's book, because I think this is where it's from, but I know some of your listeners won't have done. The story of Van Halen and the brown M&Ms.
Go for it. But let's try and keep it succinct because we need to wrap up very soon.
Yeah, no, so just a couple of minutes. It's quite a funny story that I think illustrates this whole issue quite well. It's a great example of the importance of applying algorithms consistently. Van Halen famously used to have the rock band famously had a clause in their concert contract stating that a bowl of M&Ms had to be provided backstage, but every single brown one had to be removed or they had the right to cancel the show. And they actually cancelled a show in Colorado when they found some brown M&Ms in the bowl. Now, a lot of people have assumed that that was just some weird idiosyncrasy or affectation. You know, it's a rock band trying to look a bit edgy and a bit out there, a bit weird. But no, it was actually a really clever idea. The reason it happened was that they were one of the first bands to do massive stage shows. And at the time, most bands that were touring would have 3 18-wheel trucks full of gear. They had 9, and they had a huge show with a lot of technical issues that had to be checked for the show to be successful and be safe. So they provided a very long checklist of all the things that had to be checked before the show. And what they did was they buried the M&M clause in the middle of it. So if they found a brown M&M in the bowl, it meant the organisers hadn't read through the whole list.
Poor attention to detail, right?
Yeah. So there'd almost certainly be technical errors and safety risks.
Genius.
And so it was so clever. It was a way of checking that the followed. So people thought it was weird, but it wasn't till years later, really, that it came out that was why they did it. But the key point here is that humans aren't very good at assessing data and performing tasks that are complex tasks well, that have many parts, due to the biases we have. So algorithms make it more objective, but only if we actually follow them in the first place. So if you can have checks in your system that means people are more likely to follow the system, then it's much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, that's so interesting and a fascinating story. I'm going to probably read about that afterwards. Dave, best way for the listeners to find out more about you?
Well, normally best way, if they want to speak to me, I'm always happy to chat. So you can email me at d.smith@mmu.ac.uk, or, well, that's probably the easiest way. We can always set up a little chat if you'd like. I'm always happy to chat on the phone or the internet. And apologies for my clock going off there.
No, I like the ambience of the clock. Don't worry about that. Thank you for that, Dave. And to everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode and download free resources to help you grow your Strength Studio, please go to highintensitybusiness.com and search for episode 321. And related to this episode, Inside Hit Business Membership, where we help you grow your Strength Studio business, we probably have at this stage over 100 systems, checklist templates, or algorithms. They're all synonymous with the same thing. We probably have over 100 of those from different people I've collaborated with, other business owners, and checklists that we've created and shared inside. So those are checklists for everything: retention, workout process, sales process, how you go about emailing clients, content over time, like all these different things. So you can literally take those templates and implement that into your business. And if you're interested in that, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/join. Dave, thank you so much again for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Always happy to help, and I'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks again. And to everyone who's tuned in today, thank you very much for listening.